tips that I picked up over time. I served on the biochemistry and molecular biology specialist group a few years ago, and then I've been through the agony a couple of times to be rated and re-rated. I would also like to refer you, and I will in a few times during the presentation, refer you to the documents that the research officers sent out. This year particularly, the NRF put together quite a number of very useful documents. So first of all, those of you who have already applied, or by the 15th your application will be in, so you may want to know what is going to happen between when you hand in and you would have seen what the NRF's actual closing date is. Now, the university puts together a panel of normally senior academics to look at your application. And there's normally representation from all the colleges. And there's a bit of stats on previously how many applications per college. I think last year we had a bumper number of applications from our college specifically. But the whole idea is that it's a very enabling process. So people really look at it with a view to make recommendations that you can go back and improve it. Of course, if your application is really bad, the recommendation may be that you rather wait till the following year if one knows that there's just too much work to do. And especially if, say, you within 5 years of getting a PhD, there's another 3 years left, then they may also make that recommendation. It is, of course, a recommendation and you can go against the recommendation, but unfortunately, if your rating is unsuccessful, then the university may not fight all that hard in your corner. They also contact the NRF just to make sure that you would be eligible depending on your contract. And also if they think it may be premature and that you could benefit from waiting a little bit. So the NRF is also consulted on that, and they give very realistic views on it. Normally, the university has to make a recommendation as to the category, and that is, they would just put you as A, B, C, Y, or P. And that is really just as a bit of a yardstick. Should your rating come back very differently to what the university recommended, then they will, of course, also fight harder in your corner to try and have it reevaluated and the rating perhaps changed. So like for anything that you apply for, a grant, etc., or if you have to start playing golf, you go and look at the rules or what are people expecting of you. And therefore, if you look on the university notice that went out, amongst all those documents is also one where they tell you what the reviewers need to talk about. So they give you a copy of the template that reviewers will complete, and you can even download from the NRF website. So it's not a secret. So they ask people to appraise, give an appraisal of your research outputs in the last 8 years. And they specify that's from 2014 to 2021. And they want to know what is your current standing as a researcher. So it's really about you as an individual, and we'll show later that you have to show all along what your contributions have been. And then the reviewers, if you tick the box that you would like some feedback, they give you sometimes quite good or quite detailed feedback. Sometimes there's some strange comments in there, but they collect all these recommendations and comments from the reviewers' reports, and they compile it into a document, which they in due course send out to you. And not sometimes, you know, it stings a bit, but there's normally quite useful things in there that you could use. So it is all about the appraisal for the last 8 years. So they look at the quality of your research outputs, and it's very specifically 2014 to 2021. And if you have papers that were only published 2022 or were still only in production, I'll show you where's a place where you can sneak in that information and let people know what you've published. Of course, the NRF is on a big drive to root out any publication in predatory journals. So we have even last year recommended to particular applicants, if they have published in, dare I say, the African Journal of Biotechnology, to rather just remove those applications from their records, because it's as good as well as you've never published it, because those are well-known predatory journals. And in your field, that is quite well known. Professor Maton from Stellenbosch published documents on that, and you should actually know, and this would perhaps be your final wake-up call, not to publish in predatory journals, because it doesn't do you any favors. And the reviewers know which are the predatory journals. So if you have naively or for whatever reason published in predatory journals, rather just don't report those, rather delete them. And in some journals, you could put them in under other significant outputs, and you can put a comment there that you published while it wasn't a predatory journal, or you don't agree with the standard of this journal if you really want to add it in. Then they want to know about the significance of your research in the broader context of the discipline in the field, and what impact it has on other fields. And that is where it's important to choose reviewers that know the field quite well and a bit broader. We'll get back to that later. And then I'll show you where the places where you really have to specify what you have done when it's a big group. So if you have publications with multiple authors, it's important that you indicate, especially if you sit there in the middle of the authors, what your contribution was. And they also ask, this is depending on where you work, either quite relevant or sometimes not very relevant, what impact your research had on industry and society. So if you know it had a real impact, help the reviewer by highlighting that in your self-assessment, etc. Or if you contributed to new policy, things like that, just highlight it and make the reviewer's life a bit easier. Then about the applicant's current standing as a researcher, they ask the reviewers to rate the applicant relative to his or her peers. So as I always say, it's not the NRF that rates you, it's your peers that rate you. And you have to justify, or the reviewers will justify or substantiate reasons why they say you have a certain standing, and they will use the quality of your research outputs to arrive at that. And that depends very much on your field, whether you publish in the top journals, in the very well-respected journals, etc. And they will be asked to comment on both your national and international standing, judged on your outputs in the last 8 years. So it doesn't help if you were like a real international journal, international researcher, say way back when you were still working in Europe in the year 2000, unless you've maintained this as a South African scientist or a recent scientist, recent work, that will not count. So they really look at the last 8 years. And of course, if you go for a Y rating, you're unlikely to have any international standing. You would not have international grants yet. You may not even have international collaborators, and that's perfectly fine. So it really depends on the position in your research career. And of course, this is very important if you have your eye on a B rating, is to clearly show to the reviewers, perhaps you have international research grants, you're on a research group, on a consortium with international researchers, and you got European Commission or WHO or Wellcome Trust grants that count very heavily. If you have active international collaborations, active means you write grants together, you publish together. So those all count. If you get invited to give keynote addresses at conferences, all those type of things that enhance your international profile, you need to highlight those. And then I also asked the reviewers to comment on the size of the applicant's research field and how important that field is within the discipline. So if you work in a very large field, they will just state that. So there it means if everybody doesn't know you, it's not surprising because it's a very large field, or you have a good standing in a very small field, whatever the case may be. Now we're going to look at a couple of notes per section. Now here I'm going to refer to this document that the NRF has put together this year for the first time. I haven't seen it before. And it's called Guidelines and Instructions for Applicants Completing a Rating Application, 7 Steps Score 2022. So in a few places, I'm actually going to refer to that document because it explains quite nicely with annotations on the document what to do. But it takes you through the whole application from how you create your application to what the different screenshots are. And it's also useful there because it shows you how many characters you are allowed in each field, so that you don't type away merrily in your Word document only to find that you have to sit for 3 hours to cut out characters to get to the right number. So first of all, you would update or create your CV. Now, the first time I gave this talk, it was like in October of the previous year. So if you haven't started today, you'll have to burn a few midnight oil lamps because it is a tedious process. Now, if you are only applying now for rating, you don't need to try and go and put in all your supervised students because it actually doesn't get pulled into the application. So if that would have taken you a long time, rather leave that for now, go and do that later. But if you already have a CV on the NRF website, it's very important to go and revisit each and every section because things would have changed. And what we saw last year happens quite often is that people do not update their current position. So you get a conflict there between what was a previous position, your current position. So it may perhaps look as if you're still a postdoc, but meantime, you now have a lecturing post, or you were on a contract, but now you are a permanent staff member. So those may look like splitting hairs, but from the application point of view, it's very important because you have to be an employee of a tertiary or research institution to be able to apply, and your contract must be valid for X number of years. That is all spelled out in the NRF documents, what makes you eligible to apply. So normally one would update your students. So if you have the time to do it, do that, because some of the students would have now completed. So you have to tick the different boxes on their details. And that is, of course, important later when you apply for grants. Then you will see there's an area that this magic document makes quite a bit of, put a little bit of emphasis on, and that is where you get your fields of specialization. There's about 3 pull-down menus. The first ones you can't really choose much. It's broad categories like life sciences or engineering. But eventually you get to the third one that's called fields of specialization. And there, the NRF states that it's important to add enough fields, therefore a sufficient number of fields plus a bit of information, because they actually use this or copy that or point the reviewer's attention to that. They often find that reviewers just look at that, and they say, oh, this is not in my field. If you might have sold yourself short by not showing exactly what subfield of, say, biochemistry you work on. Now, there's a whole lot of sections that need narratives. And you have to write proper narratives, not just little bullet points. And they give you a certain number of characters and make use of them. If it says 11,000 characters, fill up those 11,000 with good writing. They even tell you in this document to prepare it in MS Word. That is essential because you can do a spell check because it's very frustrating and gives a bad impression if you send out a document for reviewers and it's full of spelling mistakes. So if you can do it in MS Word, you can spell check, and B, you can check the character count all the time. Okay, the NRF online system has one or two rules, and that is if you put a new paragraph, that counts as 2 characters. But if you're old-fashioned typer like me, you put 2 spaces after a full stop. So remember to go and find and replace those 2 spaces and make it 1 space, and you'll find you save hundreds of characters. So that is an important thing. And then, of course, for when the system hangs up and all of that, you wouldn't have lost all your clever thoughts that you've just put down on paper or on the screen. Now, the first section is your personal profile. Now, that is actually a very important part, and you have 5,500 characters, and use them, because this is where you tell the reviewers a bit about yourself. And if you have a reviewer that may not have so much time, who knows, this may be all that they read. So give them all the pertinent information. So it's a bit of a story or narrative about your research career. What made you decide to become an engineer, this type of research? Just a little bit of a personal thing, but you don't need to get too philosophical and try and vent all your frustrations with the world in this. You have to paint yourself in the best possible light. This is where you talk about awards that you got, special recognition. Mention the giants on whose shoulders you stood. If they know that you were actually the PhD student of a Nobel laureate, that may make somebody feel positively disposed to you. Mention some of your significant research grants, especially international ones, especially if you want to go for a B rating. Talk a bit about the impacts of the journals where you publish. You will have more chance to talk about that in your self-assessment of your research. Name some of the journals and granting bodies that you review for. If you serve on editorial board, scientific committees, mention all of that. Then the next section, where you have to put in all your articles that you have in journals. It's very important that you input them correctly. Give the correct authors the correct title of the paper. It's amazing how somehow people put them in incorrectly, and put the DOI number so that if a reviewer wants to look at the paper, they can, because you can only upload 5 of them. So something that they also in this magic document mention is this place where you have to talk about your contribution. Now, normally your CV, if you just do your CV on the NRF website, which you can do anytime, it will not open the little fields where you have to give the applicant's contribution. It's only when you generate an NRF rating application that those fields will open and allow you to put information in. There's a character limit, but it will show you that. And also if you look in this document that the NRF sent you, it shows you there the character count. It's like 1,000 or something. Now they give you a whole list of ideas what you should put in, that you have conceptualized the research. You are the supervisor, the PhD supervisor of the first author. You have obtained the funding. Don't just say publish paper or edit it or just phrases like that, or just put down for each and every one that you've contributed 10%. They say you can add a percentage, but don't make that the only thing you add. So what those contributions were will depend on your research career. So if you're within the 5 years of getting your PhD, so in your mind you're going to for a Y rating, you will most probably be first author on most of your papers. If you're going for a C, showing that you're an established researcher, you will be the senior author. And in most of our fields that we work in, the senior author, the last author, is normally the person who directs the research. But of course, if you did a collaborative study and you're a middle author, then you explain what your contribution was. Because especially in those ones where you're not either the first author or the last author, where you have to take special care in explaining what your contribution was. So that people can see you have perhaps a very important technique that you have developed, and that is why the whole world would be coming to you to use that technique. But that may also be then reflected in the fact that you have papers from lots of different fields, but this would explain what your contribution is, that it's a consolidated contribution. State if you were invited to write a review of one of your papers as a review article. And this is also the place where you can sneak in the impact factor. I know that TEL reviewers don't just focus on impact factors and add up numbers and things like that, but especially if you have a nice impact factor journal of like 8 or 4 or whatever, put that in, because for your field, people will know what that means. Or the Q ranking of that means something to people. And if you have lots of citations, put it in. Don't put in the citations for every paper, because some of them will be 20 papers. And if they got 3 citations, everybody knows it's too little time to rake up citations. But if you already got like 23 citations for one of these papers that's published in the last 8 years, or 50 or 100, put that in, because that is really quite something. Then where you talk about your conference outputs or other recognized areas, it's very important that you're honest or realistic about a category. Don't put things as a published conference proceedings or refereed or peer-reviewed conference proceedings, because those are papers which are similar to a full journal paper. And in our university, you would have submitted all the documentation to DET for subsidy, and at UKZN to get PUs. So especially in engineering, they have lots of those. They are really refereed, peer-reviewed conference proceedings. For most of us working in the chemical, life sciences, etc., it will just be an abstract book. And that doesn't count. So don't put them in the wrong category, because your peers are people working in your field, and they will know, for instance, for us, if I say it was in the proceedings of the South African Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology, they all know it's just a book full of abstracts. And then, you know, people don't like it if you push the truth. And so most of your things that are not publications will be under other significant conference outputs. Those would be abstracts for posters or talks that you gave at conferences. So they have a value. People can see you go to conferences to disseminate your research work, but you're not trying to claim that that was a full paper. So most of your conference participation will be in this category. And add in if your student won the prize for the best poster or the best talk, but it all adds to your profile. Be careful what you call a keynote or a plenary address. It's only really if the conference invited you to do such a thing. And, you know, the reviewers go and check up, or they might have been at that conference and thought, no, that was just one of the breakaway sessions. Why does this person call it a keynote address? And you don't want people to start questioning anything that you've written in your application. Now, the best research output for the last 8 years, there you have to give proper motivations for choosing the 5 best. You want to show what was the impact there, briefly what the paper was about, and why you think this was really your 5 best. So there you have 800 characters to do it. You will typically choose the ones where you're either the first author or senior author, depending on your position in your career. You will choose the journals that have a good standing in your field, and you can mention the impact factor. And then talk about the impact of your work, if it already has had impact, lots of citations, or it has the potential to lead to a new type of diagnostic test or what it could be. And as I said, you just mention the citations if it's a nice fat number, because otherwise it's understandable if it hasn't had time to get citations. Then you can even look who has cited it, and you can slip in there that the top worker in the field has cited it, if that's really true. Just now they asked that person to be your reviewer, and if he didn't really cite it, that may look strange. Okay, and we don't, our creative work is different, so we wouldn't have exhibited in major galleries, but that is part of the NRF's descriptions. So now for where you upload them, that is later in the whole process. Once again, in this document that the NRF sent you, they give you quite a bit of information there. Also to help you in choosing them, but B, you have to use the same name that you put on the document when you save the PDF to put that in the little box where you have to name the document that you upload, because they don't want a conflict between what you actually uploaded and what you called it. So just be quite careful there. And there's a thing about the how big the document can be and things like that. But really go and look at those guidelines, because they do give you a couple of useful pointers there. Then the section on the best research output for students. There you will talk about those publications co-authored by your students. You can say that this work made them get their degree with distinction, for instance. Perhaps that student got the prize for the best poster or talk at a conference, or a professional society prize for the best dissertation or thesis, because it's all based on the research that they've done in your group. Then the section on brief description of completed research. There you can see that's one of the longer sections with 11,000 characters. And it is also, once again, a narrative. Therefore, don't just put bullet points down. And this is where you have the chance to show that your work shows coherence. So even if you work on different areas, this is the place to show there's some golden thread that runs through your work that connects it all into something that's consolidated. So that is particularly important if you work on different things, because people, especially perhaps people at the beginning of their career, you might do different things where the opportunities arise, and the reviewers don't want to see you as hopping from this to that. You just explain why you work on these different things. And as I said a bit earlier, perhaps you have a particular technique that you've discovered or developed, and people come to you to use it, and that's why you may be publishing in different areas. But to see that coherence in your work, because based on that, you are becoming an established researcher that can lead your own research. So sometimes it will help if you make little subheadings. It's important that you have a consolidated story, and you provide a review of your work, that they don't need to go and read all your papers, which they're most likely not going to do. So you want to show there what you've done and what are the important contributions that you've made. And this is also where you can slip in your research collaborations, because they can see there's a couple of co-authors there. If this person works at a very well-respected international university or research institution, just mention that because people can see that you don't work just in your own little cocoon, but that you work with international researchers as well. And this is, as I said, that's particularly important to show your international profile if you go for a B rating. Then the self-assessment of research outputs. Now, this is when you start out the most difficult thing to write, because most of us find it very difficult to blow our own trumpet. But you have to do it here. But you have to do it in a realistic way. If you have a paper that was published in a journal with the impact factor of below 1, don't call this a groundbreaking finding. You know, those are more for being published in Cell or Nature or the top journals in your field. So don't be shy to say what your contributions were, but you have to tone it down with a bit of realism. And it's all about what you've done in the 8 years, and it's normally good to start with what you identified as your best outputs and emphasize that. So you have to tell them what noteworthy contributions you made, how it extended the knowledge in the field, that type of thing. And where it's a team effort, where you have publications with lots of authors on it, explain once again what your contribution was. And you have 5,500 characters, so use them wisely. The ongoing and planned future research. Here, people just reviewers want to see that you have a clear plan of what you're going to do next. So that normally stems out of what you've written as your completed research. You want to show what you plan to do, that's realistic, that you're going to be able to build up a research group on that. And if you get rated, it also opens doors for you to apply for NRF grants. So they want to see that will be a possibility. So this is once again a narrative. So you're not going to just list 120 research topics. People don't want to see that because that has very little meaning. You want to tell a little story about each of these areas you want to work on. So for those of you within the first 5 years of getting your PhD, you hope to get a Y rating, and that means that you show potential to, in the next, by the time of the next rating, to become a C. Therefore, you want to show that you're moving out from the shadow of your supervisor, and you are now going to start carving out your own independent research niche. So even if you still publish with your PhD supervisor, it's important to show here and to explain that even although it still falls under the big umbrella of like medicinal plants, this area is yours, that you've developed, that you have an interest in, and that you're going to take as your own independent research. This is also the place, the NRF tells you even that you can put in papers that are in press, accepted or submitted. Never ever, even in a CV, talk about papers that are in preparation, because those are just pies in the sky, as we all know. We all have a top drawer in the old days when we had offices full of those plans. It's only when a paper is actually submitted or in press or accepted that they really exist. So because those will probably have a 2022 date, you can mention this year. But then in your normal publications, many journals would have a date on which they accepted it. That was 2021. And if they've given you a volume for the journal, then you would be able to put that down in your normal list. But here, for those ones that are still only accepted or in press, this is where you can mention them, because the reviewer will read it and they will see this work was already good enough to be published. Once again, you have 5,500 characters to do this and to write this narrative. Now about reviewers, I know one of you wanted specifically to get some tips on reviewers. Now this is normally a difficult thing, even for writing papers. I hate that most, is where you have to find reviewers. So you have to nominate at least 6, but They will be very happy if you give up to 10. And you have a place there to say what your relationship is about with this person. So if you collaborated with somebody 8 years ago, it's perfectly fine. Normally that puts, you know, the distance and time is say about 5 years, 5 to 8 years. So you need to put there that it's a former collaborator or a former colleague, because they really want independent researchers. So you can't put down any of the people that you publish with all the time, because they're immediately going to look through your publications and they're going to see, oh, but this person's a co-author all the time. So that doesn't make that person an independent reviewer. And it's just a no-no to put somebody down from your own institution. They do kind of mention there that, say, somebody in health sciences can put somebody down in science, but it's just better not to put UKZN reviewers down, because you kind of waste one of your 6 reviewers, because they're not going to use that person. They're very strict normally. The panels maybe even more strict than the NRF's rules about using people from your own institution. So how many national and international reviewers to use? A kind of a guide is, if you're going for a Y rating, you just need 1 or 2 international ones, because they want to see local and international ones. But don't go and pick out the most recent Nobel Prize winner, as they give us an example. Put a realistic person down, perhaps a person that you heard speaking at a conference, so you don't have any direct relationship with them, but at least you know that person knows something about your field. If you're going for a C, about 3, half of the reviewers international, and if you're going for B, make sure there's at least 4. The research office will in any case come back to you and say, you know, beef up your international reviewers if they particularly think that you should be a B. And you also have the opportunity to exclude some reviewers. They say up to 3. I'm not referring to my little cartoon here, reviewer 3. But you have to give a reason why you exclude that reviewer. You probably don't need to state, oh, this was my PhD supervisor, because they're in case not going to ask your PhD supervisor to review you. But if you know that there's a person that perhaps as a competitor, or you've perhaps in a nice way crossed swords with them before, or you just feel that once before they made a horrible comment to you at a conference, then you have a right to very diplomatically indicate that that person has a conflict of interest or something like that, to exclude them, because you don't want them to be used. But the panel will in any case look at it, and if they think, no, this person can still give a good review, then they may in any case be using that person. You will just never know. Good, so that concludes what I have to say. And I will welcome any questions that you have.
Thank you, Theresa, and thank you for your presentation. I'm sure it was well accepted by everyone, and we've learned a lot. Now open up the floor to some questions, and then maybe we can hone in down on a few points which I've jotted down, and a few of my own points as well after we answer questions on the presentation. Yinzi?
Hello, yes.
You're echoing, Yinzi.
Hello, hello.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah. Okay, now it's better. Okay, okay. Yeah, thank you, Professor. How to pronounce name? Professor. What's the name? Coetzer. Yes, yes. Thank you for your very nice and this presentation. And so yeah, sorry, I do have a few questions. One is that I find it's a little bit hard because I'm in the process of preparing my application, and I find it's a little bit hard to distinguish between best description of the past research and the self-assessment of the research output. Those all refers to the past 8 years, the golden 5 papers, right? And how can we put a correct weight onto these 2 sections? And that's my first question. And I do have other questions. So thank you.
Okay, yes, so you don't only have to focus on those 5 best papers. You will probably emphasize them because perhaps you have 15 papers that are good. So it doesn't restrict you, but you have to restrict what you talk about the last 8 years. But you will have to give it a bit of context because you will first describe a bit what you're working on, because that reviewer comes in cold. They don't know what you work on. So you would have a short paragraph just to set the scene, what field you're working on, and then you will describe, this is now for the completed research, describe what you've been doing so that they can see you work in a coherent field. You don't do a little bit here and a little bit there. Even if you do that, you have to find a way of linking it all together. Then the self-assessment is where you have to almost play a reviewer of yourself. But this is now where you have to highlight what you've done well. You don't need to give them sticks to hit you with. So if you know that you haven't published many papers, don't say, oh, I've actually published very few papers, but I'm a brilliant scientist. You just tell them why you're a brilliant scientist. If they know the field, they will know whether it's difficult to publish regularly or not. Don't say I have, in the self-assessment, I typically have to revise my papers 10 times before they accept it. You know, as I said, that just gives them things to criticize you on. So don't open doors for people to criticize you on. But be realistic. Don't make out as if you have cured cancer in your research because you haven't done it. So you have to be realistic. But the self-assessment is almost playing the reviewer, but a nice reviewer, and a reviewer that want to tell the world that you're doing good, solid research. You're training students, you're getting grants, you're making an impact in your field. I hope that helps.
Thank you. And the other question is, I'm currently a full professor in physics, and I do have a lot of students, and a lot of very good, high quality research output are actually students doing. So they are actually the first author, and I am the second author, and also the corresponding author. So I want to use, 2 of these to be my best 5. I wonder in this manner, how can I highlight it? In what angle that I can highlight it?
You see, at a university, those students wouldn't have done that research if it wasn't for you. So you, as the senior author, is always understood as the brain behind it. You conceptualized it, even if they took that idea, as any good student would do, and run further with it. That is perfectly understandable, and then you have really succeeded. So because your student did the work in the lab, wrote the first draft of the paper, is the first author, doesn't give them the intellectual property for that work. It's still your intellectual property. And you will write it that this is part of your research. You just get these hands in, these students to do the work, and through that, you develop them as scientists. But if a student is, because they did such good work, also for that work, perhaps got invited to a conference or got a scholarship to go to a conference or got the best presentation, you put that in that section where you talk about the best outputs from your students. And you highlight that this was really groundbreaking work. But of course, we all understand it started as the idea that you had. You wrote the grant, you had the original idea.
I see. Thank you. And the last one is, when you say exclude reviewers, And I do have two of them kind of a bit conflict of interest. So they do have, completely and radical different view with me on things. And we do have such kind of a quarrel in the conference. So in that sense, do we need to put a motivation to exclude those reviewers? Or
no, you can just say it's a conflict of interest. And if there's space for a bit more, you can just say we hold opposing views in this field or something like that, because the specialist group are other physicists, and they've probably been at the same conference and saw your fisticuffs. So they will know what it's all about. So they will understand.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Inzi. I saw a few hands, but they've now disappeared. Shay.
Hi, Theresa. Thanks for the great presentation. The question I have is I've got sort of advice from a couple of people now about my NRF application. And one of the things that I've been advised to was, emphasize that you've got like a good high impact factor paper, for example, or citations. However, for my reviewers, this is kind of like a normal thing for them. Publishing an impact factor 6 journal is like nothing for them, really. This is what they do regularly. So the question I'm asking is, are we writing these applications to impress our reviewers or to impress the panel? Because I don't think my reviewers would be impressed with like a paper like that. Thanks.
Yeah, you see, you don't know which reviewers the specialist group is going to select for you. They're not only going to get people who publish in impact factor 6 journals, and you should actually perhaps look at your selection of reviewers and perhaps get a few that are not very high flyers, because some of the very high flyers may be way too critical, especially if they're international ones, and they don't understand the South African situation where we don't have a lot of funds, we don't have 1 million postdocs, etc., whatever your circumstances are. So to say all your reviewers regularly publish in impact factor 6 journals, for I know your field, those are really high flyers, and you may want to think to include a few more normal people. But as I said, the panel is going to use some of your reviewers, but not all of them. And they're going to choose some other people that will understand that a person that works in South Africa, that is, been an academic for not 50 years, will publish in journals with different impact factors. It is a case of course, emphasizing it if you publish in journals with high impact factors, but you don't need to belabor the point that you also have publications in impact, if it's the case, impact factor 2. The reviewers will see that, and they will see there's a balance, and they will understand certain studies done by students. The fact that you've published it is fantastic. It went through peer review, it's an international journal. So I don't think one needs to feel that you're just writing to impress reviewers. You writing to give them a feel for your research standing and what you have accomplished.
Great, thanks.
I've got Vincent, then BJ, and then Alaika. Vincent?
Thanks, Neil, and thanks very much, Theresa, for your excellent presentation. I just want to add, I hope you can hear me. I just wanted to add on the issue around reviewers. I think the panel doesn't do much of the assessments. The key people are the reviewers. And secondly, the idea about peer review, if you are going, for example, for a B or A or even a C, but you shouldn't be choosing someone in Y as your reviewer. It's called peer review. People that are of your level or higher should be reviewing you. Just more of a comment. And then I know we talked about, as I said, they're quite critical when you choose them. What I want you to comment on, if you could comment on the selection of a reviewer or emphasize what do you look for when choosing a reviewer, it will be helpful for those who are applying.
Okay, thank you. Yes, the panel or specialist group, as they call them, they don't review your application at all. They're just there to facilitate the whole process. So it has a chairperson, and that person just directs it like a chairperson would do a meeting. And they ask all the reviewers, they perhaps share them out if it's quite a big group of applicants, share them out amongst the panel according to what their area of expertise is. And you can look on the website and see who's on the panel. So that's not a secret. And then they go and look through the reviewers that you listed and see, perhaps they see a perceived conflict of interest, or they think, oh, this may not be such a good reviewer or whatever. And they select, say, 3 that you've suggested. And then they go, and that is a very hard job if you're on the panel. They have to go and look for reviewers in the country, internationally. And they normally go and look at what these people publish on so that they have an idea whether a person understands your field. So they really try and get people that know your field of research. They will also approach people because, like, the national landscape they know quite well, so they know who are the people that are likely to write a report. And the thing is that the panel have at their disposal what scores those reviewers' reports got before, because something I didn't mention is that each review report, but it's in those documents sent you, each reviewer's report gets scored, whether it's useful or not useful, and whether it's a very good report or not. So in the panel, if they get weak reports that they can't use, they have to go and find new reviewers because they have to have at least 6 usable reports. So if for some reason somebody didn't do a good job and just wrote like 2 sentences, that is not going to count against you. They just throw that review out because that person didn't do the job properly. So they always sometimes have to work long and hard and go through several iterations to get 6 good review reports for you. Now people who work in esoteric fields, as I recall from when I was in the group, it is very difficult to find reviewers for them. And sometimes you have to go and with the begging bowl lots of times to get a review out of people. But so when you choose reviewers, think of people that understand your field. So you're a chemist, you're not going to perhaps get a biologist as a reviewer, but you're going to, for your field of chemistry, perhaps select a few people around the country. They might have been examiners for your students' theses, so they've read the work before. That normally helps them and make their life a bit easier. Or, it's a person working in a similar field. You meet them at a conference, so you know what they work on, so they can give a good idea of your work. And then international people, you may just thumbsuck names because they look, if you look at their CVs or their papers, you might have cited their papers before. So they work on a relevant field. But if you see it's a very high-flying person in the world and you're not really going to become an A-rated scientist, don't put them down because they're most probably just going to decline the offer of a review. So it's really finding your peers. So the reviewers are your peers. The panel may have people that are different types of chemists. They may even in your field have an engineer or 2 on it, but they don't review your actual application. They read through it to know what you talk about and to help them to select reviewers. And they may even look at some of the people that you cited in your papers to find reviewers, but they don't review you. That is why the NRF will always tell you, and the university, when you get your feedback, will tell you it's your peers, really your peers that work in similar field or cognate fields that comment on your standing.
Great, thanks, Theresa. BJ?
Thank you, Neil, and thank you, Theresa, for a very helpful presentation. I noticed this year that the piece on work completed by students that you've supervised, they asked for a narrative, whereas in the past it had a different wording of what you put in there. And how do you make it different from the completed research? Because it overlaps, obviously. And I'm wondering how to make the two distinct. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I can almost guess why they made it a narrative rather than the way it was before. I think I probably used to treat it more like a narrative, but because people would just kind of plonk down a couple of papers there, you know, and without saying what the student's contribution was. So I think if you have a couple of key studies where your students were really instrumental, they were the first authors, it was perhaps a good postdoc or a PhD, and they really made some key findings, you can just highlight that, because you will have in some way have to refer to the paper. And if there's enough characters, you can, you know, say it as Jones et al. With, and this is the title of the paper, that the reviewer can link that paper to your list of papers. But then just very briefly say what their contribution was, and that work was, say, also presented at the international conference and they won the best poster prize, or the person developed this technique and now they've actually been, it was a PhD student, and now they've been accepted to do a postdoc at Cambridge University. So that is also an area, if you don't put it in your personal statement, where you can brag about what happened to your students. Your students got postdocs in this, and this place. You know, that people can, the reviewers can see the work that you do and the students you produce, although nowadays they don't give the list of students in the documents anymore. They can see that the high quality students you produce make it possible for them to go and get a lecturing post at Cape Town or a postdoc in America or something like that. So I think that type of thing you can put there. But I think in our field, people also understand that most of your research that you put as your completed research, the bench work was mostly done by your students anyway. They're the hands in the lab, you the thought behind it. So it's really, I think, almost like perhaps emphasizing just some of the key papers, but put more on what the students' contribution was and where that took them.
BJ, I also think that there's a clear distinction between the work that the students completed and the work that you've completed as a researcher. And this is mainly for people who use publications where their students didn't carry out the research. A good example would be that, you know, we're chemists, and a lot of the times we collaborate with biologists and biochemists and microbiologists. And sometimes we might use 1 or 2 papers where we've made a good contribution in our list of 5 papers. So there must be a clear distinction. So in your narrative, the work that you completed, you would actually put down the collaborations that you have and the contributions that you've made to other people's work that have enhanced their work. But the work that your students would have completed would be the work that you would have carried out in your niche area. So I think it's mainly if you're going to use papers that you've published with other people that you need to make that clear distinction. If you're going to use work that you've done only with your students, then there won't be much of that distinction and to highlight you know, the points as Theresa mentioned. But I think that it was separated out into the narrative because of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thanks, BJ. Alaika?
Thanks, Prof. Kubunali. Thanks, Prof. Coetzer, for the presentation. So I just want clarity on when it comes to the self-assessment. The self-assessment of research outputs. It's actually in bold that, you know, we shouldn't really duplicate and we shouldn't have repetition. But how do you do that when you still need to highlight your research outputs? how do you not, because there is, as BJ mentioned, there is a lot of overlap. So how do you not repeat yourself, especially when it comes to mentioning your publications?
Do you want me to take that, Theresa?
Yeah, I think it's more case that where you give a summary of what your past research was. You just tell the story, what you've done. But now in the self-assessment, you say how good that work was. This is now where you start showing that you made this contribution. You were the first person to show that, one can purify this molecule, or you can make this particular connection between things. So you start talking about that you were the first to do this, or you developed the improved technology. So you start like putting a value to your research. You don't just blandly say what you've accomplished. And sometimes, even if you go back to your review reports that you got for when you published a paper, perhaps somebody made a mention there that this is, groundbreaking work, or this was a really nice contribution, without, using just a hollow phrase that one would use for anything. But just like kind of a fine distinction, but this is where you start, depending on, of course, your category. If you're going for Y, you want to show the panel that you've completed a good body of work, and that you are now setting up your own independent work. So you assess it as this was perhaps your niche that you're now further developing, that they can see that you have the potential to become an established researcher, even although you still publish mostly with your supervisor. When you're going for a C, you want to show people that you're an established researcher. And especially if you're still publishing with your PhD supervisor of 10 years ago, explain what your contribution is, even although you put it in a short narrative with each paper, but that they can see you're an established researcher, you conceptualize this field of research that you're doing. And then for going for B, you will start showing that you have an international profile. You want to emphasize in there, this work led to being invited, say, to be on an international consortium to apply for a Wellcome Trust grant, or things like that. So that self-evaluation, you want to make your category almost stand out from it. If you were going for, if you're an A-rated scientist, people will just see there that you are a world leader. You get invited to give keynotes all over the world. They're real keynotes and things like that. So I think that's the distinction, but I'm sure some of the other people with us who've been through reevaluations may want to add to that.
Yeah, thanks to I think, this is where you get to blow your own trumpet. And I think when you're choosing the best 5 papers, it also helps you to choose your best 5 papers as well. I've seen a lot of people make the grave mistake of choosing papers in high impact factor journals where they've had very little contribution. And I would actually guard against choosing that particular paper. So you might say, okay, I published a paper in Nature, but all I did in that particular paper was I dotted this T and I crossed that, that thing out. And when your reviewers look at this, they're going to say, but Alaika is not in that field. She might have been chosen because she knows a little bit about this technique. So, that's not a paper that you're going to choose as one of your best 5 papers. In your narrative, you could put that in your narrative that, I was the one that was chosen to do this technique in the paper that was published in Nature, but you're not going to choose that as one of your 5 papers. So you would have developed a body of knowledge in the 8 years. So you would have had publications in those 8 years. Look at those publications critically and think, which of these displays my niche area? And I think that's what the reviewers are looking for. Neil is an organic chemist, but there are thousands of organic chemists. What makes Neil so special? He does NMR spectroscopy. Thousands of organic chemists do NMR spectroscopy. But does everybody make hybrid compounds? No. there might be 50 people in the world that make hybrid compounds. And then who makes hybrid compounds using the quinoline molecule? There might be 5 in the world, and the paper I published 3 years ago, I presented that in a conference, locally or abroad. So when you're blowing your own trumpet, you need to blow it also with some evidence behind you that, this work was chosen. It was a paper that was published with an impact factor journal of 3, which is a very decent impact factor for, the work that I do. Most, people in my field publish in that particular journal, and this work was chosen to be presented at a conference. So you demonstrate that in a narrative. And I think, it's very important that you put your best foot forward. And that's why you've been given a chance here, because some of the reviewers might be a bit lazy and they don't want to go into the work and see, read everything else, but they're going to read your short narratives and get a good snapshot of where you are as a scientist. Because you must remember, this panel is going to review the reviews that have been given by the reviewers. So they're not going to look at your application per se and then make a decision. They're going to see, what do your peers think about you? So I think you firstly need to tell your peers what you think about yourself. Would you actually say that you are internationally recognized? And if the answer is yes, then you need to tell them why. I think I'm internationally recognized because I publish in the international journals in my field, number 1. Number 2, I've been invited to international conferences and I've given, plenaries there, or maybe I've just given invited talks there. If you haven't been, been given international recognition, you might have been given national recognition. You might have been invited to a national conference. You might have published national journals. So you need to actually appraise yourself before somebody else appraises you. So they can say, okay, I do agree with Neil. He's got some international recognition, or I don't agree with him. He doesn't really have that much international recognition. This conference is not really one that all the people in his field go to. It's a fly-by-night conference that nobody really attended. Maybe 10 people or so attended that conference. So be very honest with yourself at that point in time.
Okay, got it.
Julia.
Thanks so much.
Great. Julia?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Theresa, for the very useful tips. My question is to do with under conference outputs. You indicated we need to just put like invitations to keynote and plenary addresses. Where do we put some of the invitations may not really qualify as a keynote or plenary, but like you get an invitation to participate in a panel discussion at an international conference, or to participate in a special parallel session or related to a specific theme at a prestigious international conference. Where do I put this?
Yeah, I think one can always on the on the side of rather put it as a other significant output, but that type of thing you can emphasize in your completed research section, or you can even put it into your that personal statement section, because there you would have a bit of more characters to explain what your contribution was. Because depending on the field, some people are very touchy about what you call as a, what is really a keynote address or plenary address. But if it's a special panel, you have other places to explain that. You see, and you can say everybody gets invited to international conferences, if you apply and they accept the abstract that you present. So everybody knows that. So don't just because you got accepted for international conference now elevated to you've been invited, even if your letter states nice things like that. They write that to everybody. But if it was like really something special you did, I don't think there's spaces at the conference, the field where you fill them in to put down your own contribution. If there is, you can put there, I was invited to be on this panel, and then you can state it again in those other areas. Yeah, because that's also something that I didn't mention for the conference outputs. I think the fields that you have to complete are not very informative, but it's important that one puts, wherever you can cut and paste, to put the name of the conference, where it was held, what country, because I've seen applications before where just the way it's printed in the end, it just gives a name of a conference or a name of your paper without the name of the conference. So even if you have to put it after the title of your presentation, just make sure when you look at the printed version of your application that it states what the name of the conference was, what city it was held in, and what country. And then, of course, the year and things like that, because that all carries weight, that it's an international conference, etc.
And Julia, you must also remember that you know your peers better than anyone else. You know your discipline better than anyone else. So, for example, the engineers I know publish a lot of conference proceedings, but as chemists we don't really do that. So, if I put conference proceedings in my application, my peers are not going to look on it too kindly, but that may be different for the engineers. So if panel discussions are very important in your field, I would actually put that down, you know, because many people in your field regard panel discussions as very high. But if nobody in your field actually regard panel discussions as high, it was just something that was in a once-off thing in a conference, you know, you need to pick and choose what to write in your application, because that will hold you in good stead. So you might want to leave certain things out, you know, things that you feel is not going to give you good recognition, I would actually leave out. If it's not going to impress your peers, then I would actually leave it out. You must remember at the end of the day, this is a peer review. So the panel is going to look at what your peers think about you. So you've got to put that evidence down in your application.
Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Yinzi?
Hello, yes. Okay, so I just, because I am in the process, I just want to show you one quick thing. I don't mind to also show to the other people. So basically this is one of my, one of the research outputs. You can see it, right? This is articles in the refereed and peer-reviewed journal record. And you can see this is title, this is journal, I'm physicist or physical review, and these are the author's name. And status, publisher, etc. And it doesn't have a particular place to put into the author's contribution or my contribution. So here I basically sneak into this blank under the old author in order appearing on output, because look like there's a lot of character allowance. Would that be okay?
Well, as I said in the beginning, have you actually created a rating application on the system?
Yes, I did. Yes, I'm working on it. Yes.
Because the accompanying document stated that field only opens when you've actually created the application. If you just do your CV any time of the year, there's not the option to add your own contribution. But once you have created an application and you go from the application to your CV, then you should get a field there where you can add in own contribution. So perhaps just look at those two things online and see if you can find such a thing. Because this might be that you first did your CV and it's not linked to your actual application. So you can just go and play around with that.
Okay, thank you. I'll have a look. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Yinzi. Shay?
I just want to just comment on what Yingxi was just saying just now, and that I contacted the NRF directly about that. It looks like the newer papers, that field of author contribution just seems to have disappeared. The older papers have it, but the newer ones don't. So I'm not sure whether something's changed on the NRF system. So I've contacted Patricia at the research office, and then she's spoken to the NRF. So I think it's a system problem, not necessarily a application problem. Thanks.
Yeah, exactly.
Might be
okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay,
exactly.
Thank you.
So the old system does have a blank, and new system doesn't. That's why I had that problem.
Okay, so perhaps just put it in there where you've put it, and you will be able to see when you print the PDF if it actually comes out. But hopefully they'll correct this problem before the submission date.
Great. Thanks. I don't see any more hands, and I'm mindful of the time. I don't want to go on too long. I'll set the session till 4 o'clock because I know there's load shedding also going to happen at 4 o'clock as well. But I just want to summarize some of the points that I think is pertinent for the discussion. And I think the first point is that we need to write proper narratives. And I can't tell you the time that, amount of time people don't write proper narratives in their applications. So there's no coherence in their narratives. So they're jumping all around the place. So I'm an organic chemist, but I also help biology, and I've done this with, maths and stats and everything else. There's no coherence in your application. So try as much as possible to write it like an essay. So whenever you're given a box, maybe like a mini essay in that box, and make sure that you spell check that and make sure that you read it for completeness. You don't want a sentence hanging, and sometimes it's no fault of your own. Something might happen with the internet. You complete half a sentence, or you complete the whole sentence, but the system cuts out half your sentence. So make sure that when you complete your application, you print it out, either a hard copy or PDF these days, and read that PDF copy, because that's what the reviewers are going to be seeing. They don't want to see, a narrative cut out halfway to the page because you ran out of characters. So make sure that, if there's 180 characters, you use 180 or less characters so you don't have something cut out. This especially happens when you copy and paste from a Word document into the NRF system. You find that sometimes it just chops out half your the content, and then when it gets printed out, they don't see the other half. So be very mindful of that. It's also very important in your narratives, especially in your completed research as well, to highlight your niche area. They want to see what you are, and especially when you're choosing your 5 best publications, don't choose one in chemistry, one in biology, one in maths, one in economics because it was a high impact factor. Try to use things in a common thread. If it's going to be hybrid organic molecules, it must be 5 papers that, synthesize hybrid organic molecules. You can choose one out of there, maybe to display that, you also lent your expertise to the other field, but it must be related. It must be maybe molecules that somebody else created that you are going to analyze in the same way. And I'd only use that if it was in a high impact factor journal to show what I've done in that particular publication. But try to have, as far as possible, try to have a common thread. That's a common mistake people make when they first try to apply. They say, let me take my top impact factor journals and put that as my best 5. And that's not necessarily your best 5 publications. It's what you've done as a researcher. And your peer reviewers will actually see right through that you've just taken papers with good impact factors rather than your own research. The other thing is that when you're choosing your reviewers, it's very difficult to choose reviewers in particular areas. And, to try and think of reviewers now when you've got 2 days left to go, it might be a bit difficult. But you've got about a week or so. And if you haven't thought about reviewers yet, it's a good time to try to reach out to the people that you know. Maybe people around you in your own department, try to ask them if they can suggest reviewers that you might use. Try to use people in national and international universities that you know. If they're friends of yours, if they closely related to you in terms of collaborations and you published with them, I wouldn't actually use them as a reviewer because the panel might see that Neil is published with Theresa all the time and now he wants to use her as a reviewer as well. But I'd go to Theresa and say, can you suggest 5 people in your university or 2 or 3 people that wouldn't mind reviewing my work? And tied to that, make sure that the reviewers have the time to review. You don't want to send it to a reviewer. They're going to be too busy and they might just, glance through your proposal, write a paragraph or so and send it to the NRF. And that's not going to be very useful. I've seen many times the NRF and the panels that I've sat on, we've thrown those things out. We haven't used those because we see that the reviewer hasn't done a good job. So try to ascertain whether or not the reviewer has the time to go through your reviewer. And then choose them very carefully. If you're a full professor, and you're going for re-evaluation, you're not going to put down 5 lecturers. They're going to wonder now, why is this full professor putting down 5 people at the start of their career? How are they going to now critically analyze his work? It's going to be a bit difficult. And then they're going to choose their own reviewers, and that's sometimes is also a bit dicey. They will choose some of their own reviewers, but you also want them to choose 1 or 2 or 3 of your own, the people that you nominate as well. And the last point I have is that when you are putting down, the narrative about your past research, you also want to put down the impact of your research. So don't be shy about that. If your paper has been cited, 10 times, it's just been published 3 years ago and it's been cited 10 times, you might want to write that down. My paper was only published 3 years ago, but 10 people have cited that work. If you, as I said before, if you've presented that work at conferences, or if your students have presented it at conferences, if you started a nice discussion, you can also have seen some applications, very good applications, where they've also indicated how their paper was cited. So although their paper was cited twice, they've indicated how their paper was cited, that this person has cited my work and has continued my work in a particular fashion. That can also hold you in very good stead as well. To say that there's a group in Amsterdam that picked up on my work on quinolines, and they now use the core scaffold of my molecule, and they've made 10 other molecules based on my core work. That will hold you in good stead, going forward in your application. So feel free to write those narratives in your application. It will hold you in good stead. I don't have anything else written down here. Vincent?
Just before you close, I just wanted to say thanks very much, Neil and Theresa. I found the presentation very, very useful. My request, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, thought I had some voice. Okay, that's fine. My request would be, is it possible to share some of these useful slides for those that attended, so that while they are doing their application, even for those in future, at least we've got some guidelines. I think it's very useful to have the key points that were really brought out and were brought out very well.
Sure. No, I'll share the link to this recording later on as soon as I get it. And then I'll speak to Theresa about sharing her slides as well after this presentation. Thanks, Vincent.
Thanks. Either way will work. Thanks very much.
Great. Thanks, Vince. Biranjay?
Yes, Professor Neil, good afternoon. I have one query. In the attachment section, there are 5 attachments. So those 5 attachments are only for the 5 best outcomes, not for any other certificates.
No.
There must be research papers.
Yeah, like I applied before 3 years, my application get rejected. So where is the space where I can give my response against those reviewers' questions?
You cannot give a response to your previous application in this round, Biranjay. So there would been a chance, when you got your decision to actually try to contest it. But I think that the time has come and gone now. What you can probably do is just apply again. So try to, and very importantly, and this is for people who've been rejected once, read what the comments of the rejection were. So in all cases, when you're rejected for a rating application, they will tell you why. They will probably tell you that, your publications that you use did not have too much of your input on, or maybe that you've used publications in various fields, that you didn't have a niche area. So your next application, which will probably be now, will take into account what they've said the last time and try to address that in your application. So you don't have a chance to contest it as such, but try to use the input that they've given you in order to make your application a better one. To see, once you read your application, see, did I make the same mistakes that I made the first time? Or did I actually now address those mistakes in my new application? So remember that they're not interested whether you're a full professor or whether you're a lecturer or not. They're going to look at your 5 best publications that you took. They might also look at your best, output that you've had in the last 8 years. If it's over and above 5, I know some reviewers look at what you've published, and they might look at 1 or 2 other papers that you've had. But generally, the reviewers are going to read those 5 papers that you produce, because that's going to be what you've given them access to. So they're going to download it from the application, and they're going to read that, and they're going to see what impact that's making. And that's why I said it's so important that I know Viranje is the person who does this. You know, he doesn't do this and that and that and that and that, you know, because I don't even know what he is, because he's doing so many things. So I'm able to say that this is your niche area. So hopefully that's going. So that five attachments must be your 5 best publications.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thanks, Viranje. I think we've reached the end. I don't see any more hands. Are there any more closing remarks before I get some comments from Theresa to close? Does anyone have anything else to say before we close? I think it's been a very good session. I think it's been a very informative session. And I hope you picked up things now that you can go back to your application if you've already started. I hope at this stage, many people have started their applications. Go back to it and see whether or not you've included all the things that we have said now, especially, you know, when it comes to your best 5 publications. The reviewers want to know what you did in that particular paper. So for each of those papers, you're going to say, I was the lead author, I conceptualized the project. You know, that carries a lot of weight if you conceptualize the work. Or if you've done the laboratory work, if you're going for a Y rating, you can probably say, I carried out all the laboratory work, I analyzed the data. If you're a supervisor and you're going for reevaluation, it's very important for your reviewers to know that you supervise the students, that you've checked the data for accuracy, that you've checked the data for consistency, that you've conceptualized the projects, that you've written parts of the manuscript. You know, be very honest and be very forthright in what you've done. I think reviewers will actually like, you know, to know what you've done in your application in going to review you. So I think if there are no further questions, Theresa, do you have any closing comments?
No, not really. I'm happy to share my slides, and then I can also just emphasize that document that I'm sure it's the first year that the NRF put that together. It's really worthwhile looking through that, because I found many of the things that I had in my talk were also emphasized there, plus a few other tips. So it's really worthwhile going through that, because I think they compiled it from the type of comments that panels have picked up, where people forgot to do things or didn't really know how to do things. And so I think that's very useful.
Very good. So that just leaves me to pass a vote of thanks. So thank you, Theresa, for your time and effort in planning this presentation and making that PowerPoint presentation. It was actually quite useful. I'm sure everyone here, you know, appreciated all the effort that you put into it. And thank you for spending the time with us this afternoon. I'm sure we're all going to benefit for those of us who are applying for rating and re-rating. So I wish everybody well. I don't know if you know this, but all your applications will come to the College Dean of Research. It will come to myself. If you're in another college, it'll go to your dean as well. And the deans will then sit and go through each of the applications. And then we'll decide at that point which goes forward to the NRF. In most cases, we try to put forward as many as possible. And if something doesn't pass the university stage, it will be for a very good reason. And in this college, and I know even in health sciences as well, if we don't submit a particular application to the NRF, I will correspond with you directly to tell you why we didn't select your application to go to the NRF and to give you tips for the next round. The university will not send something that might bring the university's reputation into into debate. So we go through each of the applications that we send to the NRF, and we screen them before we send them out. And you know, in many cases, there's might be 1 or 2 that doesn't make it, and we're hoping that every application makes it to go through to the reviewers. So good luck, everybody. I look forward to seeing all your applications.
Neil, I wonder how long this internal assessment take, and when eventually you will push to NRF.
So the NRF have their closing deadlines, Yenzi. So we're very well aware of those deadlines, and we normally meet those deadlines. So I don't quite know the date yet, but the deadline that you have is the internal closing date. So generally, we might come back to you and say, do X, Y, and Z, you know, and you're allowed to make a few corrections to your application before we send it out. So the research office can actually request the NRF to open your application, make some changes, and then send it back if need be. But we'll only know that once we go through your application. So thank you, everybody. I hope you have a lovely afternoon and good luck with all your applications. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.